Hello and welcome to Jewish History Lab. Let's continue our discussion of the Bible in historical perspective, trying to understand the roots of the Jewish people. And I have to share with you at the very beginning a couple of personal moments. The whole Exodus narrative is so powerful and so central to Jewish identity that I can recall my own first meaningful encounters with this biblical narrative. And I'm sure that's something that most Jewish people can retain as well. I'll tell you two very quick episodes. The first is when I was at a Passover Seder, and I remember this is perhaps the greatest kind of generational pedagogic tool to have this celebration once a year where the elders of the family are commanded to relay, even in whatever imperfect way they can, the teaching of how the Jews were born as a people in Egypt and then in Sinai. And the children, even if they're not interested, they're forced to ask at least four questions. And the whole meal is structured around it. It's a kinetic experience. It is an essential experience with all the various tastes, the very special foods associated with things. And in that context, I remember once when I was probably maybe 6, 5, I'm not sure how young I was, but I was at my Aunt Enid's for Passover Seder. That's where we usually went. And my father of blessed memory, he handed me a spoonful of traditional horseradish. It was mixed with beets. It was not the really strong stuff, but I looked at it and he didn't tell me what it was. And I thought it was something like candy. It had that deep red color. And so I put it straight in my mouth and like, wow, I don't know what my father was thinking, whether he knew I would do that or whatever. He thought maybe I would taste a little bit of it, but my eyes started watering. I looked up at him and he said to me, Henry, that's what slavery feels like. Very, very powerful impact on a young child. The other thing that I want to share with you is when I was maybe about 8 years old, Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, a 1956 film, not exactly kosher, but nevertheless very powerful, like 3-hour epic, came to the one theater in my hometown in Northern Ontario, Canada. And this was a unique experience for me because I was the only Jewish child in that small rural town. And, I just went to the movies as often as I could because I found it so fascinating. It was just up the street from where we lived on top of my father and mother's store. And I was so totally amazed sitting in this matinee showing of this Ten Commandments because this was story I realized was all about me and my family and where I came from. And I'm sitting in this room filled with, Anglophone Protestants and Quebecois Francophones who were Catholics. And I'm looking around saying, I'm the only Jewish guy in here. In fact, I was probably the only Jewish guy, except for my parents, within about 100-mile radius. And I was so overwhelmed that I had such an amazing backstory. So this kind of feeling, both the Passover Seder and whatever meaningful encounter a child has with this it's transformational. And there's no doubt that the sages were thinking of this when they embedded the Passover rituals so deeply into the Jewish cultural fabric and into the calendar year. Anyways, I've gone on further than I wanted to here. The kind of messages that come out of the narrative of Exodus, as we discussed in Genesis. If you haven't read this, you've got to go read it right away. It's the very beginning of the book of Exodus. Just the first few chapters is like overwhelming. It describes the figure of Moses, who has an amazing story himself, transformed from a near-death experience to become a leader in Egypt, and then realizing his own background, he is exiled and then returned, and he ends up leading this nation of slaves out of the other nation of Egypt, which is again a mind-blowing experience. And there's a strong message throughout the book of Exodus that the nascent Jewish people are subservient only to the king who is king over kings, meaning only to God directly, and no human being, even one as powerful as Pharaoh, has any say over their destiny. There is a very strong element here of a collective revelation and the birth of a people as a whole. Yehuda Halevi, among other philosophers, have pointed out that one of the unique aspects of this revelation is that it's not something that happened in a miraculous way with one person or a small group of people, but this is something that happened to the entire Jewish people as a whole, as described in the book of Exodus, and as such, it is something that every Jewish person has a personal share in. There's also, this is not some kind of propaganda piece, in the sense that there's a lot of negative history in here as well. The Jews demonstrate terrible failings. The incident of the golden calf, where despite the phenomenal miracles of the 10 plagues and the Exodus itself, they nevertheless, within a short period of time, they're worshiping idols again. So it's a story of, it's a very human story, a very powerful story, and a transformational story. I'm sorry I took so long, because I know you want to get to the historical aspects of it, but I really want to emphasize that it's so important to actually read the text. It's amazing. Okay, let's go to the history. So what do we know? Unfortunately, we don't know a lot from the historical record, and that has led many of the more minimalist-oriented historians to say it just didn't happen. To say that the description of the events in the book of Exodus are fictional. I think on a logical level, there's a problem with that. It's hard to prove anything from a negative. A lack of evidence does not mean that something did not happen. All it means is that you do not have evidence. And moreover, a more sophisticated look, especially if you lean towards the maximalist interpretation of this period of history, as I do, I might as well tell you up front, there is a lot of evidence, but it is not as direct and concrete as we might like. It's rather indirect and tantalizing, and I'll leave it up to you, of course, to decide how convinced you want to be by this. Obviously, this is not a neutral historical debate, if there is such a thing. It's highly connected to theological positions and so on. At any rate, why do we have so little evidence? The first most important reason is, the pharaohs, as a matter of habit, were not in the practice of preserving their defeats in monumental architecture or in tomb paintings and things like that. Pharaohs always win. Egypt first, right? There's no strong record of pharaohs expressing humiliating defeats, which is, by the way, another thing that makes the Hebrew Bible as a historical text so amazing, because there's lots of negative information in there where Jews do the wrong thing and then they have to repent and so on. Secondly, besides the fact that it's not a cultural thing for pharaohs and Egyptian leaders to preserve this data, there's very little actual material from the area that the Jews were residing in, the land of Goshen, shown here in this satellite map. The region was in the Nile Delta, towards the easternmost range. The Nile, of course, flows from the south to the north. That's why, by the way, the Upper Nile refers to the lower area on our conventional maps. And as it approaches the Mediterranean, it fans out through the lowlands and creates this massive, very fertile region. You can see from the green in this satellite photograph, but it is not conducive to any kind of sustained quarrying or even building. All the stone that is used in the building in this region is imported from southern areas, southern quarries, and the course of the low-lying rivers in the delta were known to have changed. As one would silt up, then the river waters would be redirected, and after a certain period of time, the human settlements would be redirected. There's some fascinating allusions to this. Even in Rashi in the 11th century knew about this phenomenon. The major construction in the region was made out of mud bricks, and these are not very durable materials, and in fact much of it was actually later burned for other purposes, that it was actually combustible. So this is not material that can last a long time. And finally, papyri or documents written on a paper-like organic substance just simply do not survive. There are a very, very tiny number of scraps of paper from the region that are basically preserved when they're carbonized. If they're burned, like let's say in a scroll on the outside is like bike tight, it's very difficult to even unroll that and find out any kind of data from the period. Such as at Pompeii, there are similar types of data. So, it's very difficult to even gather any data whatsoever from the region about a slave people that, as the narrative describes, inflicted a humiliating defeat on the pharaohs that they didn't want to admit. Nevertheless, we do have some fascinating little bits of things. Like, for example, here's a bit of papyrus that is from the late 13th century, before the Common Era, which describes the brick-making work that would have taken place in this region. And we also have some fascinating tomb paintings, such as this vizier's tomb painting from about the time when the Jews would have been in the land of Goshen. And you can actually see them here working side by side with Nubians, that is Africans. And the Egyptians also did not label any of their slaves specifically as Hebrews. They tend to refer to them as one big group as Semites, which have included a lot of different people from the region. But that's not surprising either. It's hard to imagine in even 19th century America. The Americans also didn't label their African slaves by the many different tribal designations that they had. So we have lots of evidence that corroborates the story of the Jews being enslaved in the land of Goshen in the Nile Delta, and it's entirely consistent with the description that we have in the biblical text. And fascinatingly, these are amazing discoveries in 2016, later published in 2017, at Pi Ramses, which is the location of one of the two sites described as one of the major areas of building activity in the time of Moses. They discovered some mortar pits that give us an example of what it might have been like to be a slave at that time, where, you've seen the famous scene in the 1956 Ten Commandments where, Moses is in the dirt with the other slaves and he's, working the mud into bricks. This is one of those actual mud pits. And they even found some children's footprints. Now, there's no way to tell if these were Jewish children. There's no way to tell if they were made by slave children, but nevertheless, it is, it excites the imagination to place yourself in these footprints and imagine what it must have been like for the children who made them thousands of years ago. But I digress. Let's go now to the actual moment of the Exodus. Once we have the idea that, there's a lot of data that is consistent with the description in Exodus, it's not, again, direct proof that clearly confirms everything, but it corroborates it. So the most famous element, of course, is the 10 plagues that are visited upon Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And I'm not going to go into details about how we could corroborate them with geographic or geological or weather type advice. There are many different historians who try to walk through each of the plagues and say, there's a problem with the river and that caused the frogs to jump out and so on. And I think those are very interesting, but I think they're a little further away from where I'd like to go with this particular history series. Let's talk specifically, though, about the departure of the Jews from Egypt and the famous splitting of the Sea of Reeds. Now, there are many different theories as to where exactly was the route that the Jews would have taken on their way out of the land of Goshen. I've shown you here in this particular image the best guess of a very well-known scholar, again, towards the maximalist interpretation of biblical text, K.A. Kitchen. And perhaps the most important thing that people who are new to this should understand is that we're not talking about the Red Sea. For some reason, that has kind of entered English parlance, that the Jews crossed the Red Sea, which was to the south of the arrows here. You see towards the Gulf of Suez. That's not where any medieval authority or any modern scholar would place it. The Hebrew term is Yam Suf, which means literally the sea of reeds, right? Like the sea of like sort of bamboo-like shoots that come out of a wetland. And the image is not necessarily of like a massive miles-long sea, but it could have been an otherwise impassably large wetland or maybe a river area. It's very difficult to estimate exactly where it would be today because the Suez Canal was dug, completely changes the nature of the river flow through the water flow through that region, so we don't know precisely. But Dr. Kitchen opines that they went from Goshen here on the left and moving their way to the right through the wetlands, which would have been completely impassable, especially when you're pursued by Pharaoh and his chariot. So it's still quite a miraculous event in my humble opinion. And then they made their way down towards the south. There are opinions, by the way, that suggest that the Yam Suf was actually in the southernmost part of the Mediterranean and that the Jews somehow went north and then over it. I haven't indicated that on this particular map, especially because it's very clear that the Jews did not take an overland route along the coast to Israel. The Bible specifically says that God did not direct them there because it was filled with armed camps, which in fact we know the Egyptians had many different stations along the coastline there for travel and protection of travelers and so on. I don't understand exactly why some scholars suggest they went to the north. But going to the south, the next big question is, where is Mount Sinai? I have indicated the traditional location, which is so revered by Christians and Muslims, Jebel Musa, or the Mount Moses in Arabic, or Mount Sinai in English. It's not confirmed that this is in fact Mount Sinai. There are at least two other very viable contenders, one of them in the Sinai, one a little bit further to the west. But for the sake of argument, I've created the map based on Dr. Kitchen's best guess, which is much better than my own. Then they moved up towards the north to a place called Kadesh Barnea, and then looped around, and this is a process which the biblical narrative says took 40 years, looped around up to through Jordan and then crossed into Israel proper at Jericho, just north of the Dead Sea. That would be the most reasonable route to describe the Exodus. Again, on a historical level, many point to the lack of significant remains of any kind of settlement of Jews as they traveled throughout this region. The biblical text describes 600,000 adult males, which would generate a population of 2 to 3 million people, which is a monstrous number in ancient terms, and it's hard to imagine they didn't leave any trace behind. So there are different ways to approach this. Some historians have said we have to reevaluate what that number means. Does the Bible really mean to indicate to us 600,000 on a literal level, or perhaps it is some kind of metaphor? We definitely have a lot of use of metaphoric numbers in the biblical text, so perhaps it's not anywhere near that large. And even if it is a fairly significant number, whatever it might be, there's still it's hard to anticipate that a nomadic Bedouin-like lifestyle wandering in the desert is going to leave behind anything. As Dr. Kitchen points out, you're not going to find a lot of ceramic pottery to contain water and wine and things like that, because when you're carrying it around, it's much nicer to carry a wine skin than a wine jug, just for obvious reasons. So I don't want to get too far into details here, but this is basically the map. I want to conclude, however, with a couple more corroborating elements that gives us a sense of how, even though we might not have really strong direct proof, there are so many points of similarity between what we know about the culture and the region as a whole and what's contained in the biblical text, that suggest very strongly that the biblical text is authentic in its historical depiction of the Exodus. Specifically, let's have a look at Ramses II. Now, this is the pharaoh that is most likely the new pharaoh who was otherwise unnamed in the book of Exodus. He lived at just about the right time. The Egyptian propaganda we have on Ramses is pretty frightening. He was a terrifying warrior, fought many battles, which are recorded, and so we have a sense of what kind of person he was. Here's a picture of him in battle, and you can see he's stomping on the head of one of his enemies and about to drive a spear through the heart of another enemy. Here's a couple of interesting propaganda elements. This is from the Battle of Kadesh, a very important battle that was up in northern Syria. The pharaoh ranged far and wide through the whole land of Israel, as we saw with Shoshenq in the last class, and we're going to see again with Merneptah next class. You can see that on the left here, he is mounted in a chariot, very evocative of the biblical text. It gives us a sense of what that might have been like. And notice here that in one of his most famous victories, he's driving his enemies into a big river where they all drown. Now, isn't it fascinating that the biblical account of Exodus has an ironic parallel to the enemies and their chariots drowning in water? I don't know. And what does that mean if there is an ironic similarity? And I'll give you another one just for you to think about it more. On one of the commemorative wall paintings that describes that particular battle, you see Pharaoh's encampment, and there's a whole bunch of different people here that are performing various functions, but on the right is his sanctuary tent, and you can see there's his cartouche, which has the two winged features, which is ironically reminiscent of the the cherubim that decorated the ark. And that's not the only thing that's similar. A scholar named Dr. Michael Holman, who's done some fascinating work on this area in particular, he points out that it's not just the cartouche that's similar. Oh my gosh, it's the exact proportions and orientation of the camp and the tabernacle. You know, the book of Exodus has some really exciting parts, let's say about through 2/3 of it, and then it kind of like gets into the nitty-gritty of constructing this portable ark that will later be transported to Israel and then eventually be translated into the permanent temple in Jerusalem. And the structure of it is very bare, but look how similar it is to the orientation and proportions of Ramses II camp. Now, this is like an astounding kind of series of coincidences. And what exactly does it mean? It clearly suggests that the biblical text of Exodus is totally aware of how Ramesses the camp was constructed. And is it similar in order to communicate to the young Jewish people that the tabernacle is a place of sovereignty, like the Pharaoh's tent would be at war? Is it intended to be an ironic kind of jab, saying, do you think, a war tent is what protects people rather than this tabernacle of God? You know, these are questions that would cross a rabbi's eyes. I'm going to leave that to the rabbis to discuss, but I do think the similarities are incredibly striking, and I urge you to look at Dr. Holman's work, also Dr. Joshua Berman's work in this area. Absolutely fascinating. I've skipped over a lot of really cool things just to try and give you the highlights. I hope you enjoy this. We're going to continue with the next lecture as we look at the settlement of Israel, moving towards the golden era of Kings Saul, David, and Solomon. Thanks for watching.